Welcome to Chapter 12. We're going to discuss sexual assault. So, lots of different types of behaviors fall under the umbrella of sexual assault. Sexual assault is a wide umbrella that incorporates many sexual offenses. Okay, it's more inclusive. It's a preferred term, and just really kind of covers a wider variety of behavior. So under this umbrella is rape. Rape involves penetration. Doesn't matter how slight of a penetration. And that would be oral, anal, or vaginal penetration. That can be by another, it can be by a penis, but it can also be by an object. It can be with fingers, right? It can be with any body part. Now, in the UCR originally, now remember, we're using IBERS today, but in the UCR originally, this was defined as forceful and only against a female. And that changed since 2013. It now includes male and female victims and offenders, and force is presumed. So the only force that's required is the force necessary to commit the offense. It also would include people who are incapable of consenting because of age, because of any kind of mental, physical incapacity, because they're under the influence. Now, anything that falls short of penetration is going to be indecent assault and battery, okay? And under the law, there's going to be like indecent assault and battery of someone over the age of 14, under the age of 14, right? Lots of different variations, with that difference really being age. Now, statutory rape is what the crime is called in general, but it's not what it's called under the law. Only in a handful of states does it say statutory rape in the name of the offense of which you're convicted. But this is when you have had sex with somebody, penetration, who's under the age of consent. And the age of consent varies across the country. There's a handful of states that just have like a straight age of consent, like Massachusetts does. So if the person is under 16, even if the offender is also under 16, that is illegal in Massachusetts. We don't allow for any age differences, okay? If you want to know more about this, this is my expertise. And I would be happy to answer any questions. And then incest is non-forcible sexual intercourse between people who are related to each other within certain degrees, okay? So it depends on basically, it depends on the state you're in, how close of a relative you can be. I know, that's gross. So nearly all rapes occur between victims and offenders who are known to each other. It's anywhere from 80 to 90%. Strangers commit about 1/5 of reported sexual assaults. This is a highly underreported crime. The best data we're going to have on sexual assault and how common it is going to come from victimization surveys. College women are the focus of a lot of research around this, and college women are the highest risk group. Not college age women, women who are literally in college, okay? So like if you're the same age, but you're not in college, you have a slightly lower risk, okay? It's about 4.3 per 1,000 college women and 1.4 per 1,000 non-college women of the same age. There's a ton of studies done on this. They all find consistent answers. This is like a widely validated fact, okay? There's lots of different, as I mentioned, lots of different surveys done. And now in Massachusetts, colleges are required every 4 years to conduct a campus climate survey where they're asking students about their experiences with sexual assault. And we did this last year. We did this in spring of 2025. Only a handful of people did it, so you might not be familiar with it because many people chose not to answer it. And so while this data is a little dated, it's about 10 years old, this data is consistent across time. They've been doing these studies for decades, and these numbers are only going to change a tiny bit, if at all, okay? So amongst women, we have sexual battery. Battery is an unwanted touching, so that would be anything that falls short of penetration, okay? We have rape, which is penetration, and then we have sexual assault where they didn't distinguish what kind it was, okay? And you can see the percent amongst women who experience it and the percent amongst men who experience it, right? And the results of our survey are available on our website. Official data underestimate the extent of rape and sexual assault, right? Because again, official data is going to come from crimes reported to the police, and this is a highly underreported crime. Okay, so there's about 25 incidents per 100,000 female inhabitants. About 9% involve male victims. 18% of women in the United States have been raped at some point in their lifetime. So remember, rape's a narrower definition. So if you're talking about sexual assault, we're talking about 1 in 5. Okay. Children, college students, people with disabilities, and those who are incarcerated are the most vulnerable. Now, sexual assault has a lot of long-term and short-term effects on survivors. Survivor is the preferred term. If you're in the criminal justice system, you'll hear the word victim used a lot, but people who work with victims often use the word survivor. It's a little bit more empowering. It's used in domestic violence as well. But the impact of sexual assault is pretty tremendous, okay? You're victimized by the offender, and then you might be victimized again by the criminal justice system. It's pretty traumatic to be interviewed about this, to talk about it, to go to court, to have your assault covered in the press. There's a lot of scrutiny and self-blame. Victims of sexual assault are more likely to withdraw from college. They often don't finish school or withdraw and transfer to another school. It's very hard to adjust after this. A lot of psychological distress, PTSD. 4 times the rate of contemplating suicide. That's bleak. However, it doesn't mean that has to be what a survivor's experience is for the rest of their life, okay? Many people, the reason the word survivor is used is because they do triumph over this, okay? And there are a ton of supports for this. There's supports at school for this. Here in Boston, we have the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, which provides a wide variety of resources for both significant others, people who've been touched by it because someone they know is a victim or a survivor, and survivors themselves. Now, physical injury is pretty rare, okay? The sort of stuff you think about, like that you would see in a movie, right? Generally, that's pretty rare, okay? Less serious injuries are more common, cuts, bruises, right? But things like internal injuries, broken bones, gunshot wounds, super rare, okay? About 1/3 receive some form of treatment, as you guys are well aware, especially if you've had me before, right? You can go to the hospital and you can have a sexual assault kit done where they're going to collect evidence, but you can also go to the hospital just for treatment afterwards, to get treated for potential STIs, to make sure any injuries are taken care of, to have your, reproductive health examined. About 1 in 10 involve a weapon. And interestingly enough, for a long time, the leading recommendations were sometimes that fighting back can actually end up in you getting hurt more. But there is research that's been done that says that generally speaking, people do not get hurt more. And in fact, people who fight back often get hurt less, or the assault is not fully accomplished. It's not completed. Now, what are things that make us more vulnerable to sexual assault? Okay, this would be part of the field of victimology, where we look at victims and we look and see what sort of things put them at higher risk, what sort of situations place someone at higher risk. None of this means a victim is at fault for a crime that's happened to them. Victims are never, ever, ever at fault. Okay, but there are things that make us more vulnerable, and that's important to know. So, bars, fraternity parties, use of drugs and alcohol. Okay, drugs and alcohol are involved in nearly every sexual assault. Okay, they often take place near a victim's home. We know that age is a risk factor, right? That a significant number of people are victimized before the age of 18. 71% of women who experience a rape, it occurs before they're 18, okay? And then ages 18 to 24, as we just talked about, college-age women are at high risk. Often by intimate partners, okay? So some of those are strangers. About 1/4 of assaults are done by strangers, okay? Many are husbands, ex-husbands, boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, people with whom someone has had an intimate relationship, okay? But another 10% are relatives, and then, other people known to the victim, but not necessarily, could be a friend, an acquaintance. If you've been victimized before, that actually places you at higher risk of victimization again. So any sort of risky behavior is going to be something that makes you more vulnerable to all kinds of victimization, but in particular sexual assault. Now, offenders are not all the same, okay? There's a lot of variety in what motivates someone to commit a sexual assault, although generally they are about power and control and not about sexual contact. It is often pleasurable and arousing for an offender to have power and control over somebody, okay? But it is not about, like, when people say something like, oh, that person couldn't have assaulted that victim because that person is attractive and they could easily have sex and find a consensual sexual partner. That's not what sexual assault is about, okay? Now, some offenders are using just enough coercion to gain compliance from a victim, and some, their main goal is to cause harm physically and psychologically to their victim. And we could talk for a very long time about motivations of sex offenders, and we do have a class on sex offenders. Now, sex offenders tend to be younger. Under 25 is about 42% of arrests. A lot of older offenders tend to be child molesters. And while people will talk about how sex offenders have a high recidivism rate, that's a little bit misleading. They do recidivate, right? Especially people who are driven by some sort of compulsion, right? But it's not quite as high as people think it is, okay? So it's somewhere between 10 and 15%. About a little over 1% of rapists were rearrested for a new sex crime within 6 months, okay? Now, that's what we often mean by recidivism. We mean someone's being arrested again for a crime. About 5% within 3 years, 41% for some other type of crime within 3 years, and 15% for a violent offense within 3 years. Okay, so sex offenders are often committing a wide variety of crimes. Child molesters tend to reoffend more often. Now, we can often look at elements of a crime scene, and some of them might tell us a little bit about whether or not that offender is likely to offend again. A couple of themes that might be prevalent would be hostility. Is there verbal aggression and violence towards the victim? Is there some insulting, demeaning language? Was there force beyond what's required for penetration? So did they tear the victim's clothing, things along that line? Criminality. Do they regard the victim as an inanimate object that needs to be restrained and coerced? Is the goal to incapacitate more than to demean? And then sexual exploitation, which is an attempt by an offender to bond with the victim by showing affection, making apologies. And in this case, the victim is treated as a reactive living person. And so if you look at these, hostility is not predictive of recidivism with strangers, but is with acquaintances. Criminality is predictive for stranger rapes, but not acquaintance rapes. And that pseudo-intimacy is not predictive for strangers, but is predictive for acquaintances. Now, you folks are probably familiar with the concept of rape myths. They exist throughout our culture extensively. They're attitudes and beliefs that are generally false, but widely and persistently held, and they justify male aggression against women. Okay? They stem from patriarchal traditional views of masculinity, that men should be strong, assertive, right? That women need to be dominated and coerced, that women mean yes when they say no, right? And men who subscribe to these myths are often hostile towards women, okay? Men who are dominant, controlling, powerful, right? We expect that in our culture, and we expect women to be submissive, permissive, and compliant. There's a lot of self-reports amongst offenders of fantasy, imagery of sexual aggression. Over a third of college men said that they fantasize about aggressively raping a woman. Sorry. And 54% fantasize about, quote, forcing a woman to have sex. Some men misperceive women's verbal and nonverbal communications. Verbal communication should be super clear. No means no. They often interpret women's behavior as having sexual intent when it does not. They often have difficulty decoding rejection when a woman is dressed provocatively by their own perception, and sexual interest when a woman is dressed more conservatively. Okay, so like if a woman's dressed a certain way, men have a tendency to interpret that as them being interested. An influence of alcohol impairs our judgment. We also have a lot of sexually explicit media, right? So depending on the type of pornography and characteristics of the offender, we could see, other things, the sexually explicit media playing a role there. That's not to say that if you, watch spicy movies or watch pornography, that there's something negative about you. It kind of depends on what you're watching, right? And what you're taking away from that. And do you realize that pornography is not real? Okay. Pornography can, under specific circumstances, facilitate aggressive sexual behavior. But generally speaking, pornography does not cause sexual abuse. Okay. Depends on like how much aggressive content is in the film. How did the victims react? How aroused is the viewer by those depictions? Now, here in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we have a sex offender unit within our Department of Corrections, and it's housed at Bridgewater State Hospital. And they have done extensive research on typologies of sex offenders, of rapists, and they have validated quite a bit of their research. I think if you look it up, it's under like MPTC 3, I think. So they find 4 major categories of rapists. One is displaced aggression, and that is when there's a presence of a high degree of non-sexualized aggression or rage, and that's expressed through verbal, physical assault that exceeds what is necessary to gain compliance from the victim. Okay, there's generally going to be clear evidence in the verbalization, in the behavior, that they intend to degrade and humiliate their victim. There isn't evidence amongst these offenders that behavior is eroticized or sexual pleasure is derived from those acts. The injurious acts, the injury, right, the acts engaged in harming someone are not focused exclusively on parts of the body that have sexual significance. So the violence may take place against things other than sexual body parts. Compensatory rapists have an intense sexual arousal that's initiated by stimuli in the environment. They want to prove their sexual prowess and adequacy. They might, in their general day-to-day life, be passive and withdrawn and socially inept and really live in a fantasy world. And their victims might be a stranger that they see frequently or watch or follow. Now, sexually aggressive rapists have sexual and aggressive features at equal levels, okay? So you got the aggression and the sexual desire equally, okay? Sexual arousal for these offenders is associated with violence and pain. They are convinced that women enjoy being raped, okay? There's lots of research out there where people have interviewed sex offenders, and some of them have said that their victims enjoyed it, that their victims came on to them, that children came on to them and enjoyed it, okay? They have convinced themselves of this. They think the victim resisting and struggling is like part of a game. It's a form of protesting too much, and it's a deeply ingrained belief, right? And it's often going to come from rape myths. They've often been married multiple times, engage in domestic violence. They have really bad dating behavior, dating back to their teen years. They're trouble in school, low tolerance for frustration. Now, impulsive rapists engage in spontaneous rape when the opportunity presents itself, often in the context of another crime. These often have callous indifference to the welfare and comfort of their victim, but there's often no more force than necessary to gain compliance of the victim. Holy cow, there's so many typos on this slide. Apologies. Now, Massachusetts Treatment Center revises their research as they continue to do more research. They've added some other motives. Opportunity, which is similar to an impulsive rapist. Okay? These are impulsive predatory acts. It's the result of being somewhere where the opportunity for a sexual attack arises. Pervasive anger is where anger generates and pervades all areas of their life, primarily directed at women. Long history of antisocial violent behavior. And they tend to inflict high levels of physical injury on their victims. Sadistic rapists, their motivation is sexual gratification. They engage in sexually aggressive fantasies that are violent, okay? And then vindictiveness is when they're characterized by anger directed exclusively at women. And the purpose here is to physically hurt them and to degrade and humiliate them. Now in version 4, it's going to be our last version from the MTC. They have 3 paths that these focus on core personality traits. And if you look at a couple of these, they come right out of the psychopathy playbook. Callous unemotionality, okay? Pathological lying, grandiose sense of self, superficial charm, little empathy or compassion for others, conning and manipulative behavior patterns. That's a psychopath. Antisocial and impulsivity. These are also features of psychopathy. These are people with poor behavioral control, early behavioral problems. They resemble lifetime chronic persistent offenders, which we talked about earlier. We talked about 2 types of juvenile offenders. And then there's hypersexual personality traits, which is exactly what it sounds like. A lot of preoccupation with sex, compulsivity, history of child sexual abuse. This is often present in the background of juvenile sex offenders. And so here our book has a little chart for us, right? So we've got these types and then... Okay. Now, other people have done typologies too, and one of those is Groth. Groth talks about anger rapists, power rapists, and sadistic rapists. And you'll notice these are very similar to other typologies. People have just sort of categorized them slightly differently. So an anger rapist uses force, more force than necessary for compliance, and is engaging in degrading and humiliating behavior. They're going to let you know their contempt for you through abusive and profane language. The sex is dirty, offensive, and disgusting and is used to defile and degrade the victim. And the attacks are often prompted by some previous conflict with or humiliation by a woman that's important or significant in their life. Power rapists seek to establish power and control over victims. The amount of force and threat used depends on the degree of submission shown by the victim. Penetration here is a way of asserting power, identity, authority, showing that you are dominant. These victims may have been held captive or repeatedly assaulted. And then a sadistic rapist includes both, right? A sadistic rapist is getting off sexually on the aggression. Now, just to wrap this up, talk about treatment very briefly. Many offenders are resistant to treatment, okay? This is going to follow the most effective systems are going to follow 3 basic principles. Looking at risk. Now, risk assumes we can predict someone's behavior, and we're not great at this, okay? The level of treatment should match the risk level of the offender. Needs are looking at dynamic risk factors. Okay, dynamic risk factors are things that change throughout our lifetime. That could be our relationship status, our employment status, who we're hanging out with for friends, our attitudes and beliefs. Whereas static risk factors, which are not part of this, are things that don't change. Those are things like your gender, your prior history. And then we want to think about responsivity. We want to deliver treatment in a style and mode that's consistent with the ability and learning style of the offender. And cognitive behavioral therapy has fared pretty well with sex offenders.